Larissa's POV.
The dish in my hand slipped yet again, falling into the sink. I was lucky this time, it didn't crash to the marbled floors. Else I would receive an earful from Gwendolyn about breaking dishes for 1 week in a row. I couldn't help but remember the pale-faced woman that day. She looked like a shadow of the life I once had, richly dressed with smoothened skin that looked like she didn't even have claws or anything. But she was far from likable, and I was even more annoyed that I couldn't get the image of her hands on his skin out of my head. He'd made it so damn clear that he would never accept me as his mate, no matter how I chose to think about it. He would not care if I died now, as long as I took care of his son. I gripped the sink at the thought of a second rejection. Maybe it would be best I left him alone and simply work like he wanted me to. His crude actions towards me were more than 1,000 confirmations, but it was hurtful nonetheless. The woman had mentioned his wife again. I wonder what had happened to her. I shook my head at the thought again. I shouldn't get involved. I'm here to take care of Declan alone, that's the best I can do. I picked up the dish from the sink and dried it with a soft cloth before placing it on the rack. I felt numb as I cleaned up the kitchen, although thankful to have been left alone in the kitchen for the weekend. When I was done, I made my way to the living room where Declan was sitting idly with Gwendolyn. She beamed as soon as she saw me, but the toddler had jumped off the couch to play with a figure on the table. "Thanks for watching him for me," I said quickly, dropping cross-legged on the ground beside Declan. "It's no big deal, as long as you made a meal for me too," she replied with a nod and rose to her feet. "You both have fun, it's time for me to enjoy the weekend." "Where are you going?" "To my room. And Omega needs her beauty sleep." She drawled out with what sounded like a cackle and pranced her way out of the living room with a subtle sway of her hips. I let out a faint chuckle at her exaggerated behavior. That was so Gwen. I turned my attention to the mute toddler beside me. He had the upper half of his hair in a ponytail, just like he'd wanted this morning. With his tongue sticking out the corner of his rose-tinted lips, the fair-skinned boy had his attention ingrained in the wooden knife in his hand. On the table, there were a number of toy soldiers in the form of transformed wolves holding swords of their own. I couldn't help but be so mesmerized by his cuteness, despite his overly sensitive persona for a child. He would click his tongue and wrap his tiny fingers over the handle, poking one of the static figures. When it wouldn't move, he would pout and try to concentrate on stabbing them until they fell. Then he would yelp in victory and giggle to himself before beginning the whole process again. I'd never seen a child that was such a physical replica of his father, yet not nearly as identical in personality. Although he didn't fancy me the best, he was a sweet child. Declan suddenly whipped his head to look at me with doe eyes, then ran across his nostrils before waving a wooden knife in my face. "Take it," he said softly, thrusting it into my hand that rested idly on the table. Surprised, I took the knife from him and watched him continue to poke at the toy figures. He pulled my index finger and pointed at another figure. "Fight with me." His words were a little incoherent, but reminded me of sugary pastels. "This one is my friend, this one too. Is he your friend too?" I chuckled at his questions. He looked genuinely interested in what I had to say. He shifted his weight on both knees, then continued to look at me intently. "Of course, Declan. My friend is your friend too. Are we friends?" "Yes." "Then, Semir." He pulled my finger even closer. It was funny to see him use up his strength in pulling me, and it gave me much satisfaction when I went along with what he wanted. His smile was infectious. "This one is our enemy." "Why is he your enemy, Declan?" I cooed. "Because he's not my friend. He's bad. Will you tell me your name?" "Larissa." "Lar-Isa. Isa." He repeated cutely, scrunching his nose. I smiled at his actions, patting his soft tresses. "Isa, okay?" "Isa is my friend, this one is our enemy because he's bad," he said again, sounding a little upset. I picked up the wooden knife he'd thrusted into my hands and poked at the figure he'd claimed to be his enemy, earning a loud giggle from him. I laughed in return, and he giggled even louder, bobbing his head as he did. This sweet soul, who would ever have hurt him so? I could never have imagined I would be having so much fun in my life without death breathing down my neck. let alone with a 3-year-old. I suddenly had the urge to teach him one of my favorite childhood hobbies. My father had said that I'd picked it up at a very young age and dropped it when I realized I was more ladylike than the average lady. It made me laugh to know he thought like that about me, even going as far as telling me that Richard wanted to learn it so much because a lady shouldn't have such hobbies. "Declan dear, do you want to learn to catch crickets with me? I promise it'll be fun," I said as sweetly as I could muster, patting his shoulders. He nodded quickly and flashed me a toothy smile. The heavens, his cuteness. I rose to my feet quickly and picked him to very little resistance from him. He nuzzled into my neck before whipping his head back and scrunching his nose. Smiling at him one last time, we made our way out of the living room and through the back exit. It was the same way I'd gone when Annalise had brought me to the Alpha's study. There was a guard in front of the main gate to the mansion, but he smiled when he saw us together. Perhaps he was one of the few pleasant-faced guards in the mansion. Putting him down, I pulled him in the direction that Annalise had pointed to me once, hoping that somehow we would make it in the right direction. I wanted to take him to the less dense part of woods where there were mostly grasses and shrubs, for fear that he might be scratched by something unusual. He tapped me twice, motioning for me to put him down once he'd arrived at the border between the woods and an empty area of land. The boy giggled to himself and kicked at some dry leaves that crumpled underneath his little feet. The dryness worried me, though. It was late April, and the first rains hadn't come yet. Shaking off the feeling, I walked briskly to hold him by the hand and pulled him to squat beside me, behind a tree. "Stay here with me. The crickets will be out by now." I cooed again and he nodded, half clinging to my dress. I looked around to spot some crickets, but none were in sight. Instead, I felt him fidgeting and whipped my head around quickly to see him bobbing his head and giggling to himself. "Shower," he wheezed out amidst his soft giggles, and in a flash he was out under the canopy of trees. He was twirling and giggling to himself, kicking at the leaves and laughing so brightly. More than he ever had in the few weeks I've been here. I cocked my head at his statement, however. "Shower?" Stretching my hand out, I felt soft water droplets stain my palms and the skin of my arms. I looked up and felt the same droplets fall onto my face, and I lit up immediately at the realization. Was this it? The first rain? "Declan!" I yelled amidst laughter, rushing to his sides and twirling with him. My inner child was working its way well out of me. I couldn't even remember the last time I'd been so overjoyed to see the rain or play in it. It had always been my fantasy to dance with my mate in the rain and then fight to kiss and make up. But here I was, having my dream come true with a toddler. Declan, this sensitive child that brought my world together, turned out to be my first in a lot of ways. I felt my heart swell, just watching him so happy. I picked him up after a while, twirling and laughing when he nuzzled into my neck. His breath against my skin was ticklish. Running my hands through his wet mass of honey-colored hair, I felt him scratch his neck before wrapping his small arms around my neck. I didn't even know how long we had been playing, but the showers had eventually reduced significantly into a faint drizzle. Maybe it had stopped altogether, I wouldn't know. The large canopy of tree branches gave the illusion that it still drizzled, whether or not that was true. "Let's go home, my dear. Unfortunately, the crickets must have gone home by now," I said gently, wiping away the stray wet hairs from my face. He nodded and let out a small sneeze, scratching his neck again. He fell limp soon after, earning a small smile from me. He was asleep, so much for such a child. The thought that Declan may have gotten a cold worried me. Did we stay out so long in the rain? Without much thought, I made my way out of the woods, dragging my feet through the clear path we'd gone through earlier till we made it out and to the gate of the mansion. It had stopped raining completely, but we were still damp from the exposure. I continued through the gate when I noticed the black SUV parked at the Alpha's favorite spot. I felt cold chills run down my spine at that. Was he home already? But he didn't ever get home till 6 p.m. Besides, his son was in my arms. I was prepared to answer a bajillion questions. Squaring my shoulders, I made my way through the entrance and halted in my tracks at a harsh thundering. Except that it wasn't the sound of thundering. It was the voice of Alpha Caden. "Where the hell are you coming from?" He was standing in the center of the living room with both hands hanging loosely at his hips, but I dared not look at his face. The corners of my lips quivered harshly, the only movements that could be heard in the room that had now fallen eerily silent were those of Declan's soft snoring. I said, "Where the fuck are you coming from?" His voice was crass and angry, causing me to flinch and flip my eyes shut. I opened them again and noticed a figure beside him. I could definitely recognize Gwen's unmistakable figure. I tilted my head in slight confusion. Gwen had said something about enjoying her weekend, so what was she still doing here? Declan and I were having some fun catching crickets in the woods. I forced out and made myself to look at him. Maybe I shouldn't have, because if his piercing glare could kill, I may have been dead 1,000 times in that minute. Under the rain? Larissa, under the fucking rain? I'm so sorry, I got carried away. I pleaded again. I didn't know what else I was supposed to do. His usually green eyes had lost most of its silver chrome and were blazing an angry orange. I half expected him to haul at me or threaten to strangle me like he always did, yet he did none of that. Instead, his expression shifted into an ominous smile. The only obvious indication that he was mad were his eyes. Bewildered, I saw Gwen shift uncomfortably before approaching me and muttering an apology. She whisked the sleeping toddler from my arms and walked away, up the stairs, leaving me alone in the living room with a wolf that was ready to finally kill me. "This is just perfect, Larissa. You've used up your probation," he spat out, shoving both hands in his pockets. In a flash, 2 strong arms had locked mine in place, and even my frantic efforts weren't enough to pry them off. What have I done wrong? My cries came out like strangled whispers. I didn't want him to see me cry like a mess that I was yet again. All I've ever done was cry, and all he would ever do was relish in my cries. Crossing your boundaries. He shifted his attention to the man who held me in place, now folding his hands and squaring his shoulders. Lock her up where she would never see a beam of light.
Cadence POV.
The faint drops of rain hitting my windowsill was enough to pry me awake from my drowsiness, as sleep seemed to have eluded me tonight. The lights were turned off, yet I could make out even the tiniest details in my study. The bookshelf stood like its own force, towering above every other piece of furniture in the study, and the pile on the desk appeared like its own monstrosity. I rose my head from my makeshift pillow, staring off at the window that was draped with thin white curtains. The soft glow of the moon would have made it more beautiful. Perhaps as beautiful as the first night spent in Amaya's arms. The thought of that woman gave me the ick, but what disturbed me more was Larissa's tear-filled expression. It pissed me to no end when my wolf had suddenly gone quiet after locking her up to solitude. She deserved it, everything she was getting. The heavens needed me to mete out a befitting punishment for such a cheat, so why wouldn't my wolf simply comply with me? If that wasn't enough, she took my son out in the rain. Although for some reason, it made me feel at peace to see him sleep so soundly. But she was treading on dangerous ground, and I won't let her get away with it. I should have killed her when I had the chance. Or let her die out in the woods so the hyenas could feed on her body. I let out a tired yawn, running a hand through my hair. I couldn't even focus on the work that spilled over. Yawning again, I pushed the chair backwards and rose to my feet. I stared at my work table for a few seconds before ultimately deciding to drag myself to my room, shutting the door after me. I continued to drag my feet up the stairs until I'd reached my room, twisting the doorknob quickly and plopping onto the bed without thinking twice. But the sounds of strangled whispers forced me awake again. What the hell? I croaked out in frustration. The room was still its dark entity, but the whispers were piercing. I propped myself up to a sitting position immediately and rubbed at my eyes. We couldn't be under attack. My men were more than capable of wreaking havoc as well. My senses were instantly awoken when I recognized the sound. It was faint, but I could pick it up even through my soundproof walls. It wasn't the sound of whispers like I had thought. It was the sound of muffled crying, coming from Declan's room. Declan? I questioned, marveling at my own idiocy. Wait, Declan. I shot off the bed immediately and raced to the door, slamming it unintentionally behind me. I rushed to his room, throwing the door open to see him squirming on his bed. The muffled cries had grown louder, confirming my fears. My steps had slowed down significantly at the sight of him in his brightly lit room as I approached his bed. Leaning down ever so slightly, I ran my fingers through his fluffy hair. His eyes were shut firmly, yet there were streams of tears flowing from them. Heavy beads of sweat had formed on his forehead, and his small lips were muttering incoherent words. He looked terrified in his sleep, even with me rubbing soothing circles into his hair. "Declan." I tapped him gently, trying to wake him up. Perhaps it was a bad dream. It wasn't the first time he was doing this. I still had no idea how to handle it. If I could, however, I wanted to make my way into whatever dreams he had and murder those bastards. "Son, I'm here. Nobody's going to hurt you." "Mommy." He finally spoke up, halting my movements. He said those words again, curling up away from my hold. Taken aback by his sudden call, I sat down by the edge of his bed and pulled him closer, trying to pat him awake. I watched him flinch and finally open his eyes, only to yell harshly and call for his mother. Well, I'll be damned. He continued to squirm and call loudly, and no matter how much I tried to restrain his crying, he wouldn't stop. His hysteria was plunging me into deep confusion. There was no way his mother would be here. What else did he want me to do? The door flew open almost immediately to reveal Gwendolyn half sprinting from wherever it is she was coming from. She stood at the door for a split second before jogging to where I sat with Declan in my arms. She seemed hesitant at first to pick him up, and it was starting to irritate me. "I believe you can see it's an emergency." I snapped at her, and she nodded quickly, reaching out to take him away and patting at his back gently. She seemed to be muttering sweet nothings in his ears, but he only screamed again before his cries reduced to muffles. "What's wrong with him?" "I can't say for sure." She started, rocking him back and forth. His crying persisted nonetheless. "But some nights, he's like this and nothing can console him." "You want me to watch my son cry all night? Was that what I hired servants for?" I forced my voice to a harsh whisper. What did she mean by that? I cocked a brow, now rising to my feet. She looked away. I could see her lips quiver in what I assumed was fear. "No, my lord. But I do know something that might work." "Then speak up." "I suggest you bring Larissa here. She might know what to do. Perhaps you'd like to join her there." I growled angrily at the mention of her name, my nostrils slightly flaring. She whipped up her head in surprise, shaking it frantically with one hand while the other supported Declan's weight. "No, no, my lord." She pointed to him, her voice laced with fear. "Your son has grown familiar with her, and I'm certain that she can control his crying. You better find a solution yourself." I spat back. I would never entertain such humiliation. Bringing a woman I'd locked up to take care of my son? The height of mockery. "Please, Alpha," she pleaded again. Her eyes had turned into closed crescents as she continued rocking him in her arms. "Please. Larissa is the only one that can help him calm down now. Listen to her, Caden. It's no use being so stubborn." While I wanted one thing, my wolf wanted another. Why did my son have to be on the line? I was more than reluctant to let her out. But on the other hand, it would break me if he cried like this till dawn. "Very well then. Fetch her from the cell at the basement."
Larissa's POV.
My dress had dried on my skin and had creased so terribly that it would look like mismatched chicken feathers. I sat on the cold ground with my knees to my chest, using them as a headrest. Just like the Alpha wanted, the room was the darkest in the mansion, and I'd never felt so alone or dejected in my life. Not even when I was sold. I sniffled softly, wiping away yet another streak of tears from my face. What did I do so wrong to be locked up? The fact that I wanted an iota of happiness in my misery of a life? I didn't even understand why the Alpha hated me so much. So much that he was willing to lock me away from the child that he'd put me in charge of. His hate towards me was unfounded and made no sense. I felt my chest tighten as I choked out more tears. How much different was he from Stefan? I didn't want to ever compare my second chance mate to that beastly he-wolf, but I couldn't help it. I already accepted that Alpha Caden was never going to have anything to do with me, but what was this? How much more hell did I have to go through for him to leave me alone? Even my wolf had gone silent. My heart ached at everything. I simply wanted to bury my head in the wall and cry myself to sleep. But the sounds of metal clanking made me rouse up from my thoughts. I opened my eyes as wide as I could, taking in all the light available that was next to nothing. But there was a sudden flash of light and I flipped my eyes shut at the intensity. Were they here to finally kill me? Larissa. Larissa. The voice called softly and I opened my eyes very slowly. I could make out the silhouette of dark hair on a stout body. It was definitely a woman. Who's there? I called back weakly, still blinking at the brightness. The figure was approaching me quickly and I drew back in fear. If it was death, they weren't going to get rid of me that easily. Larissa, it's me. It's Gwen. Gwen. I called again, looking past the light until she rose the source of light to her face. Only then did I realize that it was a flashlight. She was smiling at me, one that held an apology behind it. Yes, it's me. I'm so sorry you were locked up. I let out a dry, bitter laugh. It didn't sound like me at all. I ran one hand through my now matted ponytail, watching her expression shift into one of concern. What's there to be sorry for? I don't think he wants anything to do with me or his son. On the contrary, you're wrong. She countered in defense, leaning against the wall with one shoulder, and I cocked a brow. What do you mean? I wanted to glare at my wolf for spiking up immediately. She didn't seem to understand that there was nothing that would ever happen between me and that arrogant alpha. He's calling for you. And why should I go with you? So he can humiliate me and call me names again? Because defying his orders is like begging for death. Then maybe I want to beg for death. Larissa. Gwen groaned in frustration, moving quickly to crouch beside my sitting form on the ground. He really needs your attention. I'm not going. You can tell him that. I finished, wiping some tears that had escaped from my eyes. I didn't like that she was looking at me with pity. I'd seen so many of those eyes that my tolerance was beginning to wear thin. But I felt my throat run dry at her next words. It's about Declan. He's ill. I blinked a few times, trying to process her words. The toddler was my most important obligation. How had he managed to fall sick? My eyes darted around at the thought. I could feel Gwen's hands rest on my shoulders, shaking them gently. So you have to come with me. I didn't want to go, but I had no choice now. Nodding hesitantly, I rose to my feet and motioned for her to lead. I could faintly see a smile plastered on her lips as she stood up as well, leading us out of the dark room. The way out was dark and unfamiliar, except for the bright flashlight in Gwen's hands. She led me through the back exit until we were standing in the very living room that the Alpha had sent orders to lock me up. We walked up the stairs till I was now standing in front of Declan's room, whose door was wide open. Unlike the dark cell, his room were filled with pastel lights. Alpha Caden was looking at me with blank eyes. Standing at one corner of the room, his arms were folded and he kept staring at me, making me so uncomfortable that I wanted to jump out of my skin. I gulped harshly at the sight, slowly coming to the consciousness of the crying toddler on his bed. I mustered a bow at him before walking briskly to the foot of his son's bed. Declan was frowning harshly, whimpering and curling towards the windows. I let out a sigh watching him like that. I reached out to his forehead, and he turned around immediately to grab my finger. "Mommy," he whispered again, catching me off guard. He looked terrified even, and I began rubbing circles in his forehead. Even his skin against my palms did not feel right. Guilty, I reached down to kiss his forehead and I felt him relax slowly. I was certain that Alpha Caden was boring holes through my spine, but I could care less. Declan was my top priority now, not his bitchy ass. I turned around with the blankiest expression I could muster, seeing him with one raised brow and a slight frown. "Well, what's wrong with him?" "He has a slight fever. But it's okay. I'm going to take care of him." All I could hear at that point was a voice at the back of my head screaming that it was my fault.
Larissa's POV.
It was my fault that he had a fever. If only I hadn't been so carried away playing in the rain, he would never have gotten sick. Even when he had me locked up, it was surprising that he wasn't well taken care of. It looked like no one gave him a hot shower. I half expected for the Alpha to say something mean yet again, but he said nothing. Instead, he stood there in his sweats and with both arms folded, watching my every move while Gwen walked out of the room, leaving it to an awkward silence. I turned my attention back to Declan, running my fingers through his hair. Truly, it reminded me of honey. Except that his climbing temperature worried me. I don't think that's necessary. He finally spoke up, and I could pick up the grogginess in his usually demeaning tone. I looked back at him, shaking my head quickly, but he clicked his tongue at me. Take him to Annalise instead. She would be able to take care of him and give some medication. You should have thought of that before calling me here. I thought to myself, still shaking my head. No, I insist. It's very late, and I can nurse him to good health if you'll let me. I countered, albeit calmly, struggling not to raise my voice at him. I expected him to yank me up and throw me out at the sudden burst of boldness, but all I could hear was a sigh and my heartbeat racing.
Cadence POV.
Her eyes held no emotions, yet I could see flickers of concern every time she turned to glance at Declan. She finally rose to her feet and made her way to his bathroom, stepping out with a small bowl of water and a towel. She bowed awkwardly again before walking back to his bed and set the materials on the hard floor beside the bed. She dipped the piece of fabric in the water before dunking it completely and squeezing off the excesses. Then she folded the towel and placed it on his forehead. I walked up to the bedside and stood there, partly intrigued and partly annoyed. I didn't even know what I was pissed about. Maybe it was just the sight of her and her disheveled blonde hair touching my son. Or the fact that I couldn't take care of my son myself. I'm going to wipe your body, okay? She half whispered in his ears before working her slender fingers to undo the buttons of his pajamas. It isn't even vanilla scented. She scoffed again, prying the pajama top off of him. He whimpered at that, but she tapped the towel on his forehead. She knew about the vanilla scent? In one swift movement, she picked up the towel and dumped it in the bowl of water again before ridding it of the excess water. She folded the towel neatly before wiping his body in slow streaks. She would repeat the whole process again and whisper softly in his ears till he had fallen completely quiet. Alpha, you're making me uncomfortable. I was jabbed out of my trance at her sudden comment, and I cocked a brow. I had no idea how long I was standing there, but she had wiped down his entire body and clothed him. Wait, did she just say I was making her uncomfortable? In my own house? I questioned, silently daring her to speak up. She turned to look at me with the same dead eyes I'd seen earlier, then bowed curtly. My apologies, but yes. How dare? Please. Her voice was quiet and her eyes began darting around as if in fear. Declan is sleeping, and he shouldn't be woken up. I folded my arms, watching her intently. When I didn't say anything, she settled for staring at the ground and fiddling with the hem of her dress. I noticed some red marks on her skin as she continued to play with her dress, then with her fingers. You've been staring at me, it's making it difficult for me to watch over Declan. She finally pointed out, forcing herself to look at me. I could see the hesitation in her voice, but I was more concerned about my son. You're not off the hook yet. I ground out harshly, relishing in the feeling of watching her cower, although slightly. Just because I let you take care of him tonight, doesn't mean you're out of my blacklist. With one last glare, I walked out of the room and shut the door behind me. I strode to my room, pausing briefly at the door before twisting the knob and pushing it open. I could feel my chest beating harshly. Frustrated, I walked to the bathroom instead and doused my head in water. The feeling of the cold liquid running down my head did me some good by helping me cool off, but it didn't do much to help shift my attention from the woman in my son's room. I hadn't thought of letting her in his room tonight in the first place. And for some reason I was trusting enough to leave my son with the same woman who had taken him to play under the rain. The sight of her wiping down his body and cooing at him was on constant replay in my head even while I stared at my wet-headed reflection in the mirror. Declan was Amaya's son, yet she wouldn't have done that. I remembered when Declan was born. Joyous as I was, Amaya was always concerned about how to take care of him. He'd gotten a high fever once at 13 months old, and Amaya had been frantic that night. She could never compare to the relaxedness that Larissa held. She'd complained all night in agitation, ultimately calling for Annalise to take care of him. She had thought he was going to die. For fuck's sake, she couldn't even control a simple fever. The pearls on her nails getting ruined worried her more than the health of her own child, so why Larissa? Why could she be so put together in the middle of an emergency? Because you've jumped into conclusion.
Shut the fuck up.
I warned again. I hated the fact that my wolf wouldn't take my side. Yes, she was my mate and I didn't want her. What else was there? There was no possible attraction to her. Not when she was a filthy cheat. You don't even know that for sure. I know what I'm talking about, so save it or I'll make sure to shut you up for good. I snarled back without the authority that I'd intended. Get to know her first. My wolf spoke up again and I growled in response. You do not want to see me kick you out. I turned on the tap in the sink and placed my head under the stream of water. I didn't care about what he thought of her. I was never going to have anything to do with her. Whether or not he liked it, there was no way in hell that I'd set myself up so badly. I finally turned off the tap after a full minute, picking up a towel in the room to remove the water from my hair. I walked back to my room, shaking off whatever feeling that raided my thoughts and forced myself to bed. I found myself straining to hear something through the walls, but there were no significant sounds. All I could hear were soft snoring. I let out a sigh at that and wrapped my sheets around my head in hopes of drifting off to a deep slumber. Asterisk. The next morning, I walked out of my room with my hair gelled back and in a form-fitting burgundy suit. I was standing in front of Declan's room, a little conflicted on whether or not to open the door. Hesitantly, I eventually pushed it open to see that the lights were still turned on. By the foot of his bed, the blonde-haired woman sat with her back turned to the door and was sleeping. She looked uncomfortable but slept through it, only stirring when there were soft, childlike mumbles. She finally jolted up from sleep when the mumbles grew. I sprang forward, almost racing into the room, but she beat me to it. She didn't even know that I was there, but I was satisfied with watching them from afar. She picked up a towel and placed it in his head, patting him gently until he went to sleep again. The muscles in her back loosened up and relaxed, and she heaved a relieved sigh before nuzzling herself back to sleep. I felt an odd sense of satisfaction at the scene in front of me. Letting out a sigh, I shut the door and made my way down the stairs where Hunter was waiting patiently for me. Larissa reminded me of a child. Why would she sleep there so uncomfortably? None of my housekeepers had ever been so sacrificial. I found myself wondering if Declan meant more than half of what he meant to me, to her.